Good morning, Ohio. It's James Lewis of This Dream House, a show that's all about the house. Joining us today is Gaylon White, author of Left on Base in the Bush League. So, Gaylon, thank you for joining us.
Pleased to be here. Thank you.
So, what inspired you to write the book?
I've always been intrigued by what keeps baseball players who were great in the minors, sometimes legends, what kept them from making the majors entirely, or if they got there, they had little or no success. Now, in Left on Base in the Bush Leagues, there are a couple players that we feature who were very successful in the majors, then were essentially exiled to the minors. And I was very curious about them. But in essence, the book is about 13 players who wound up in the minors. In other words, left on base.
With your book, it takes place, a little bit after the peak of minor league baseball? Does that sound
Yes, right. And I think this is a book you can judge by its cover, in that it's the photograph on the cover was on the cover of Life magazine in 1948 when the Dodgers opened Dodgertown, and they had 515 rookies at spring training, and the Life magazine photographer took a photograph of these rookies looking up at the camera. So it covers essentially the post-World War II era up to the first Major League expansion in 1961. Then you had at that time you only had 16 teams, roughly 25 players to a roster, and you had all these minor leagues. And at the time the Life magazine photograph was taken, there were 58 minor leagues. The next year, 49 was the apex. They had 59 minor leagues. So a lot of competition in the minors. You had a lot of great players as a result left on base in the minors. So that's the focus of the era, and it's you had baseball in something like 500 different towns at one time. So virtually every town in America had a baseball team of some type. Of course, I'm writing about the professionals, but there were a lot of semi-pro teams also.
Oh, wow. So, yeah, it seems like everybody was in on the baseball craze.
They were. In fact, one of the players featured in the book, Joe Bauman, he is the all-time home run king in terms of the minor leagues. He had 72 at Roswell in 1954. Joe, at 4 different times during his career, he led the minor leagues in home runs. There's now the top home run hitter in the minor leagues receives the Joe Bauman Trophy. But Joe left baseball entirely at one point and went semi-pro and played in Elk City, Oklahoma for 3 years. And they had a great semi-pro team, went to the championship finals all 3 years that he was there. So Joe Bauman, if you look at his home run records, which are well over 300 in the minors, there were about 7 years, including 4 in the military, that were lost years. He didn't hit anything. So that's the kind of player that I'm writing about. Now, in Joe's case, I'm in Roswell, New Mexico as we speak, and that's where Joe played. That's also where they believe there were UFOs at one time, and there does seem to be some intersection. But Joe, he had a gasoline station here at Texaco. He had one in Elk City. So I like to say he pumped gas during the day and pumped home runs over the fence at night.
Nice. Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like there was a lot going on in Roswell back then.
Well, it's interesting. I've been out here this week promoting the book and doing some book signings. I was over in nearby Artesia, New Mexico, about 40 miles away. Joe was persuaded to come back to organized baseball by a doctor who was moving one of his teams to Artesia in 1952. So Joe came back in 52 and 53. He played in Artesia. Both years he had over 50 home runs. Then because he wanted to have a gas station and Artesia was too small, he thought, to support one, he came over here to Roswell and in 1954 set the all-time record. Now Barry Bonds came along later in 2001 and hit 73. But I like to differentiate between the two. Joe's home runs were steroid-free.
Exactly. Yeah, we can't say that about Barry, but yeah, I doubt back then that they had to worry about steroids too much.
Joe was he ate steak, potatoes, and drank beer. How's that?
That's good fuel to hit home runs with. Kind of like Babe Ruth and all that back in the day.
Yeah. Now, Joe was a big guy. He was 6'5", 245 pounds, and he was a Bunyan-esque. One Sports Illustrated called him one time a Bunyan-esque character. So he's one of the legends that I write about. And also here in Roswell, Tom Jordan Sr. He lives here. He's still living. He'll be 100 in September. He's the oldest living Major League ball player. He played briefly with 3 different teams in the majors. But in Tom's case, he walked away from all 3 teams because he had a ranch and his family were here in Roswell. He can make more money at the ranch than he could play in Major League Baseball because most players in the majors made the minimum salary, which was essentially $6,000 to $7,000 during that time. So Tom, I mean, if you look at his numbers, 18 years in the minors, 338 lifetime batting average, 267 home runs. It's not too shabby.
Oh, definitely.
In the majors, no. In the majors, now he batted exactly 100 times and had a 240 batting average, but he was, he was dynamite against the Yankees. Hit well over 400. So there's every reason to believe that if he had stayed in the majors, that he would have been quite successful. But again, a lot of these guys could make more money in the minors. They certainly were treated better in the minors than they were in the majors, so this is where they chose to stay.
So if a pitcher doesn't give up any hits, it's a no-hitter. If a pitcher, doesn't give up any walks and no hits, it's a perfect game. What is if they strike out 27 batters in a game?
Well, and that was Ron Netchai, otherwise known as Rocket Ron. He played for Bristol in the Appalachian League. That was the Class D League in 1952. He is the only player in history to strike out 27 in a 9-inning game. It was not a perfect game. It was a no-hitter, but it wasn't a perfect game. There was a pass ball on a couple strikeouts that allowed the batter to reach base. There was an error in the field by, I think it was the shortstop. So it was not a perfect game, and of course Netchai was a guy who threw a lot of pitches because he was all over the place in terms of wildness. But he struck out 27 in that one game. And what's amazing about it, he wound up with the Pirates at the end of the season. So to make the jump from the bottom of the minors at Class D all the way to the majors within 2 months, which is what he did, that was quite amazing. Branch Rickey, who was the head of the Pirates at the time, and Joe Gargiulo, who was one of their catchers, both call Ron Netchai the best pitching prospect that they ever saw. He was drafted into the Army at the end of the 52 season. He already had ulcers. The Army food just caused the ulcers to get worse, and he went from 180 pounds to 150. Consider now he was 6'5", so Joe Gargiulo liked to say, "Who hung the uniform on the mound?" But Ron came up with a sore arm. He tried to. He never made it back to the majors. He pitched some in the minors, but the sore arm really kept him from going on. I think what he in effect had was a torn rotator cuff. But baseball people at that time didn't know what one was, so that was the end of his career.
The one I thought was interesting, and I'm kind of confused by this one. So they're Pat Stacey.
Pat Stacey, yes.
Yeah. So was he Irish or was he Cuban?
He was Irish, but in fact, what he did was Pat Stacey was a very fine hitter. He was after the war, he managed and played and was partial owner of the team in Big Spring, Texas. That was a Class D League team. He was the only non-Cuban on the team. What he did was, when he built the Big Spring team, he built it with Cuban players. Now, that was extremely unusual at that time. Now, the Washington Senators did have a pipeline to Cuba, and they were using them on their roster, basically light-skinned Cubans. And Pat Stacey did the same thing here in West Texas. He built his team around the Cubans. They won 2 pennants, finished second 3 times, and third another over it would be a 6-year period. So he was highly regarded in this area. He won 3 batting titles. He was a very fine player. If it hadn't been for the war, he probably would have made it to the majors. And he came over here to Roswell in 1953 to manage the Roswell team, and he bought the team. And he was the manager here when Joe Bauman hit 72 home runs and batted behind Bauman, which required the pitchers to pay a little more attention, not to walk him every time. As it was, Bauman walked 150 times the season that he hit 72 home runs. And by the way, he did that in 138 games. So it's quite a record. It won't be touched. Ron Netchai's 27 strikeouts in one game. It won't be touched. Bob Cruz, another player I write about, who held the home run record before Joel Bauman broke it. Bob Cruz hit 69 at Amarillo in 1948. He drove in 254 runs during that season. Nobody's going to touch that RBI record. So a lot of the players that I write about have records that will never be broken. And it's interesting how they did that, and it's also interesting why, because even though they had all this great success in the minors, why they didn't go up any higher. Joe Bauman never made it to the majors. Bob Cruz never made it to the majors. Steve Dalkowski, who I write about in the chapter with Ron Netchai, he didn't make it to the majors, and he was, many people think that he threw harder than anybody else in history, well over 100 miles per hour. And that was the opinion of Cal Ripken's father, who caught him in the minors. So Dalkowski was a hard drinker. He drank as hard as he threw, and of course that kind of did in his career. Dalkowski was the inspiration, by the way, for the character in Bull Durham, Nuke LaRouche.
So it feels, with this book and your other books, you do have a passion for, of course, baseball, but not only that, shining the light on the less known players, like your last one, Artie Wilson.
Yes. Yes, I like the obscure player. Essentially, what I look for are good stories. And they're all the better if they're good stories about players who people don't know much about, and therefore I can shed light on them through these wonderful stories that surround their careers. It's the other thing too is you start to dig into these things, you find others. I knew about Frosty Kennedy, who hit 60 home runs at Plainview in 1956, but I wasn't that familiar with his career. But I came across this quote here, and he liked to tell people that he made more money in the minors, plus he was treated to dinner and drinks wherever he played. And this quote, "I was a king in the minor leagues. Why go up to the majors and be just a spear carrier?" And that was the attitude of a lot of these guys. They were heroes in the towns in which they played, and so they preferred playing there. It was just a different era. Baseball, minor league baseball, the community rallied around that. In many cases, it was the big event. Every game was the big event, and the crowd would go there, and they packed the stadium. I'm going to La Mesa, Texas, for an event tomorrow night, Saturday, and it was a town. It's a town of around 8,000 or 9,000 people, and it was known as the biggest little town in baseball at one time because of the crowds. They drew over 100,000 one year. So I am attracted to these, you might say, obscure stories, but beyond just being obscure, they are fascinating stories.
Oh, definitely. I've enjoyed, obviously, this book, but your other books, all the way back to Handsome Ransom Jackson, and learning about some of the more interesting people in baseball that have gotten overlooked over the years.
But one of the things, when I was interviewing Tom Jordan Sr., for example, the first few times I interviewed Tom Jordan Sr., it was more or less to collect information on some other players who I was featuring. But as the more and more I talked with him, I realized he was the subject of a chapter, and not just because of him. His son, Tommy Jordan Jr., pitched and hit the Roswell Little League team in 1956 to the Little League World Series. They won 12 straight games. This was it was the second class Little League in the town, you might say, because they had the worst field. But they went all the way, won the Little League World Series title, and for that to happen to his son, and then also what happened around the same time with the increased popularity of Little League, that contributed to the demise of the minor leagues. Now, most people attribute the demise of the minor leagues to television, the development of television, and also the invention and the widespread use of air conditioning. Both of those are true, but it was also Little League. It was just interesting that Little League siphoned off a lot of the people who were going to minor league games. The parents or the grandparents who were going to see minor league games started to go to see the Little League, and so that was the inspiration for the chapter on Tom Jordan and his son was Father, Son, and Little League. So those are the kind of things that I kind of look for. And the other, Pat Stacy with the Cuban story, initially that was not in the book, but I kept coming across all these stories about his Cubans on his team, and what it prompted was other teams to try to do the same. But the difference is that Stacy was able to handle these Cubans very effectively. He was a very fine manager, and some of the other managers just didn't have what it takes to get the most out of the Cubans, and so they had, in many cases, problems. So it was also contributed to the integration of baseball in the Southwest, because first it was the light-skinned Cubans, and then some of the darker-skinned Cubans started to come in. And by the mid-'50s, the barriers were down in this part of the country.
Oh, nice. So, I mean, yeah, it covers, just such important part of not just baseball history, but American history, it sounds like.
Yeah, it is. And that's the other thing I try to do in my books. I try to capture what it was like at that time. Most people nowadays, there's a lot of people who like to read about baseball, and they weren't around in the 50s. And I think if you read this book, it'll give you a feeling of being there. And, of course, people who lived through the 50s, it's going to bring back a lot of memories. I've already had a lot of response along that line. Just in my writing in general, there was a ball player named Jack Hanna who wrote me a letter once, and I was kind of bogged down in the first book, The Bilko Athletic Club, which I wrote. And I say bogged down, I wasn't making the progress that I wanted to make. And he wrote me this letter that encouraged me, and I'd like to read it to you. What would life be if it weren't for the remembrances? We have the future, of which we know nothing. We have the present, which is so close and moving so swiftly by that we can't make much of it. But the past is as clear as our memories will allow. It is the memories of the past that convince me how important what I am doing is in the present. And I think what I found is that people in reading some of my books and reading these stories, it brings back memories that they had long forgotten. And in many cases, they're fond memories. I was inspired myself as a kid going through Sporting News when it came out every week, and the baseball guides that came out every year, and looking at these names that I knew nothing about. All you heard about, of course, was either the minor league players in your hometown or the major leaguers. But you didn't know about all these other minor leagues and the players in those leagues. And these baseball guides and the Sporting News brought them to your attention. And you couldn't help but be curious in many cases of why these guys didn't move up higher in the baseball classifications, and why you didn't hear from them later on. And Al Pinkston, who is in one of the chapters, he's called the greatest minor league hitter you never heard of, won 6 minor league batting titles, 4 straight in the Mexican League. He's in the Mexican League Baseball Hall of Fame. Most people don't know anything about Al Pinkston, but a great hitter, and had great success in the minors. He made it as far as spring training, the Kansas City Athletics in 1955, and that's it. He just disappeared into the landscape of baseball.
So before we let you go, Gaylon, what is the next book that you're working on?
I'm working on a book about a little town in Louisiana, Cajun country, Crowley, Louisiana. They were known as the biggest little town in baseball. I mentioned earlier that La Mesa was too. There were quite a few towns that were competing for that honor in the 50s. But Crowley, for 3 straight years, drew over 100,000 people It's a town of just a little less than 12,000. A fascinating town with a great history. What a lot of people don't know is that JFK, in running for president in 1960, he gave a speech in Crowley, Louisiana, along with Jackie. And the crowd was 135,000 people. That was the largest crowd in the run-up to his election in 1960. And they came in Crowley, Louisiana. So I'm writing about baseball in that town. They didn't have a team until 1950. And then in 1957, there was a hurricane that wiped out their ballpark and did a lot of damage in the area where their league was. So I'm writing about that period because there were some very fascinating players that came through there, including George Brunette, who did make it to the majors, and played and pitched until age 48 in the Mexican League, and still holds the all-time record for strikeouts in the minors. So it has both a fascinating history from a baseball standpoint and also in other areas such as political.
And the other thing before we let you go, where can our listeners follow you on social media and the web?
I have a website, Gaylon White, that's Gaylon, whitebaseball.com. And there'll be, if they go on the website, there'll be information on each book, and then there's an orders page. And click on that, and currently the publisher, Roman & Littlefield, is offering a 30% discount on the book. That brings the price, $36 retail price, down to $25.10 or $25.20, something like that, plus $5 shipping. So you're getting the book for $30, and that's a great value. And urge you to go to the website, take advantage of that special 30% offer.
Sounds great. Thank you for joining us again, Gaylon.
Thank you, James. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.